Hello and welcome to BICOM podcast. I'm Richard Pater, the director of BICOM. It's Wednesday, the 16th of September, the day after the historic ceremony at the White House yesterday. And joining me for post-match analysis is Ilan Goldenberg, who is the Senior Fellow and Director of the Middle East Security Program at the Center for New American Security. Thank you very much, Ilan, for joining me.
Great to be here.
So just as a brief introduction, Ilan is a foreign policy expert, extensive experience within the government and within the think tank community as well, covering Iran's nuclear program, the Israeli-Palestinian relations, and broader regional issues. I should say Ilan also serves as the Chief of Staff and the Special Envoy for Israel-Palestinian Negotiations in the US State Department in the previous Obama administration. So that's also a very, very useful background when we come to discuss what's on the agenda today. Ilan, if we can start off kind of and frame it as someone that is so identified with the Democrat administration last time round, and let's be polite about it and call this the current administration's less than conventional foreign policy. How did it feel watching the ceremony yesterday?
Well, look, I mean, I think the ceremony was a positive, and I think that you can take partisan politics out of it. And say that whenever you have states normalizing relations in the Middle East, a region that has been so racked with conflict and instability, it's a good thing. So I was very happy to see, Prime Minister Netanyahu with, the Emirati and Bahraini foreign ministers and President Trump. Like, that's a good thing. I do, from a partisan political perspective, there are moments where, President Trump inserted the political campaign here in the United States into his comments. That wasn't healthy. And it's pretty clear that he was using it to some extent, for his own political benefits. But, I think overall it's a positive good. I mean, the other thing to remember about this is that I think it's a big deal. I think it is, as I said, a positive step, but I also don't necessarily view it as transformational as, say, the Israel-Egypt peace treaty or the Jordan peace treaty, because you're not talking about countries that were previously at war with each other, and you're also in Bahrain and UAE not talking about, they obviously matter, especially the UAE is an important player in the region, but you're not talking about Saudi Arabia, you're not talking about Egypt, you're not talking about one of the pillars of the region, and so. Absolutely a positive, step that we should all welcome. We should also be realistic about what it does and does not do.
Sure. I mean, what did you make? What was your initial reaction? What did you make of the content of the speeches and the dynamic of yesterday? What did you take from that?
So a couple of things. One, I think that's really important is that while President Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu were there, Mohammed bin Zayed chose not to come. And I think, the Emirati crown prince, who's really the head of state. And I think for a couple of reasons. One is sort of the differing dynamic. Israel has always wanted and welcomed this type of engagement with the Arab world and sees it as a net positive in its politics. While for MBZ, this is much more complicated in terms of his own political constituency, in terms of views at home. The other is also the difference in how MBZ right now is approaching, and the UAE in particular is approaching American domestic politics versus how Prime Minister Netanyahu is approaching it. I mean, for Netanyahu, he's clearly put all of his eggs in the Trump basket, and he has no problem just making that clear. I think for MBZ and the Emiratis in particular, they have, they definitely have embraced Trump, but they've also realized that they've probably over-embraced him and also over-embraced the Saudis. And we're very much seen in Washington as being associated with the Saudis and associated with Trump. And they actually view this move as a way of distancing themselves a little bit from the Saudis and kind of signaling, hey, we are more pragmatic partners. And importantly, by emphasizing and taking annexation off the table, they're also doing something that's very positive for Democrats. I mean, if annexation had gone ahead, then I think you would be faced with a very challenging situation, let's say for President Biden in early 2021, with Democrats having firmly opposed it and having major concerns, which would lead to potential early confrontation between Israel and the United States and the new Democratic administration, which is a big political headache and frankly a distraction when there's so many other bigger issues on the table right now, like China and COVID-19 and things like that. And so for the Emiratis to successfully push annexation off the table is also something I think that's very much welcomed by Democrats. And so those are a couple of, I think, some of the key takeaways. And it was also interesting that it was only MBZ or ABZ, the Emirati foreign minister, and the Bahraini foreign minister who both mentioned the Palestinian issue. It wasn't even mentioned by President Trump or Prime Minister Netanyahu, which sort of tells you where it lies in sort of the order of priority.
Sure. I mean, onto that. I mean, they mentioned it, but it was really only a name check in all, in terms of kind of the conventional kind of watchwords which we're used to hearing. There was nothing on final status issues, nothing on 67 lines or land swaps, or kind of the issues that we're used to be talking about. The Palestinians largely kind of seem irrelevant to a degree in this. I mean, if you were advising the Palestinians, what advice would you give them to make them more relevant in the current diplomatic game?
Sure. So look, the Palestinian approach has been to just object and fight this. And I understand why they're doing it, and I understand their frustration and their feelings of betrayal. And they also have a pretty bad relationship with the UAE that is a lot more tied to the fact that the UAE supports Mohammed Dahlan, who is one of Abu Mazen's chief rivals, and that creates a sense of tension, right? But I'm not sure that the Palestinian approach right now is very smart, because this is happening. And if I were them, I would sooner be, rather than trying to fight it, I would sooner be going to these Arab states and trying to get things out of it, trying to get concessions from Israel in exchange for this. But the reality is, look, I think what this tells you two things, right? There are those who say the Palestinians don't matter at all. The Palestinian issue is over. Nobody cares. If that was the case, Israel giving up or at least putting off annexation for a number of years as a key condition for this agreement would not have been on the table, right? So that the fact that the Emiratis asked for that is a pretty strong indicator that, yeah, the Palestinian issue still matters. But on the other hand, the argument that there will never be peace between, some of the Arab states and Israel without progress on the Palestinian issue or a two-state solution is also kind of being disproven by that, right? It matters, but it doesn't matter as much as it used to. And so that's how the Palestinians should approach it. I mean, I also think this idea that somehow, peace with the Arabs would lead to peace with the Palestinians, and that the Arab states were the key to all of this, is kind of a false notion, and has been for a long time. The Arab states have their own priorities and increasingly are frustrated with the Palestinians. So maybe this is a reality check for the Palestinians. At the end of the day, it's got to be about them, not about the Arab states. And they can't count on the Arab states for this, at least not the Gulf states. I mean, the ones that really matter in all of this, I think the countries that actually are most invested in the Palestinian issue in the Arab world, it's the Jordanians, right? Who actually have millions of Palestinians living in their territory, who share a large border with the West Bank, with the future Palestinian state. And that's where the focus and energy of both Palestinian policy needs to be in terms of engaging with the Arab world, and frankly, American policy, right? I mean, the fixation the Trump administration has had on the Gulf states, they've made progress there, but they've entirely cut out and ignored the Jordanians. And we have Israel-Jordan relations really at its lowest point in 25 years since the 1994 peace treaty. And that's, I think, a much more significant strategic, problem, right? Like trading UAE for Jordan is not a good deal for Israel. And so I think resuscitating that and making progress there is also important.
I mean, it's interesting on that, when I've been talking to Israeli officials, and what they've said is that they hope that actually these new ties with the Gulf states can act kind of as an incentive to Jordan to get back in the game. I mean, you're right that the Israeli-Jordanian ties are at perhaps a real low right now, and they have been for 2 or 3 years. But there's all sort of suggestions about reviving the Red to Dead Sea project, for example, and maybe bring in UAE funding. So they could be a way to combine issues there. I wonder, just looking at we didn't see the full text when it was signed, but it's now been released last night. Was there anything in the actual text of the agreements that stood out to you as being particularly significant?
I mean, look, first, and actually just one other point on that, I do think there's an opportunity with Jordan that has less to do with the UAE deal and more with annexation coming off the table. The threat of annexation was making it almost impossible for the Jordanians to engage with Israel. And so if that is genuinely off the table for a number of years, I think that will make a huge difference in terms of creating opportunity for Israel, Jordan, and engagement. On the text of the document, look, I thought it was quite, anodyne overall. I thought what was interesting that wasn't in there was, well, maybe let's start with what was in there that was positive. Just lots of modes of cooperation, right? And opportunities for cooperation. And that matters a lot. I mean, one of the things that's interesting, and one of the reasons that the UAE really went for this also is the UAE is one of the better run and managed countries in the region economically and societally. And, they see in Israel an opportunity, a major economic opportunity. And Israel should see in the UAE a major economic opportunity. And especially in the aftermath of COVID-19, with crashing oil prices and slowing economies, I mean, there's real opportunities here for cooperation. And so I thought that, the effort there and the detail there, which was really the focus of the agreements, was a positive one. And so we'll see where all that goes. And then on top of that, what was interesting that wasn't in there was, again, very little about the Palestinians. I thought it was interesting. There was some concern, at least in the initial statement that came out in August. There was some language in there about the Trump plan that threw into question, the continued support for the status quo on the Temple Mount, Haram el-Sharif. That language was excised. There was nothing about that in there, which is good. The only reference to the Trump plan recalled the Trump plan. Recall is a word you use in these documents when one of the parties doesn't want to say they support or endorse or promote, right? There's no commitment to the Trump plan. Recall, because the Emiratis were not willing to move beyond recalling the Trump plan. So I thought that was interesting. But there's also no references, for example, to UN Security Council Resolution 242 or some of the traditional parameters, as you talked about, which I think was probably a nod to the Trump plan, or at least to the Trump guys. That's like kind of the middle ground they came down on between, I imagine, American administration that would have liked to see much more full-throated endorsement of their ideas for Israeli-Palestinian peace. And the Arab states, who would be much happier to just stick with some of the traditional parameters and statements that have long been the basis for, really since 1967 for the conflict. So I think that the solution was to really not reference any of it. And then, there was not a lot in there about security cooperation, which is the other key component here, and motivation, right? It's this idea of working together against Iran. It's this idea of working together against extremism and terrorism. But I understand why you wouldn't want that in a public document like this that would only just provoke and, instead, keep it happy, keep it, about, cooperation and unicorns and love for everybody, and keep the more sensitive stuff out of a public peace treaty agreement like this.
And it's interesting you comment on that, because one of the aspects that struck me in the peace and security section, I've got it here in front of me. I'll just quote from part of it. It says, "The undertaking to prevent terrorist attacks against each other from respective territories." That's all fine. And then it goes, "as well as deny any support for such activities abroad or allowing such support on or from their respective territories." And I wonder if that was a reference to Iranian Revolutionary Guard activity in Dubai, their businesses, their shell businesses, money laundering, and if we can expect some activity on that front.
Yeah, I don't think you're going to see a change. I mean, there's already pretty deep cooperation between Israel and, UAE and some of the other Gulf states on Iran issues. I don't think you're going to see a dramatic change like this happen on that front, because it already is so deep on intelligence sharing, on, security cooperation. And I would be pretty surprised if you saw a dramatic shift in terms of what the UAE does and what is allowed for Iran to do in Dubai. I mean, the reality is Abu Dhabi and Dubai have very different perspectives on Iran. Dubai is right across the water. Its money comes from trade as a major hub, and a large chunk of that comes from Iran. So the U.S. government has a long history of sort of nudging and pushing Dubai to stop some of this stuff. And actually, it's had an impact. I mean, and things are a lot better now than they used to be, but some of this stuff's going to continue. I don't see that I'd have a hard time seeing that as part of the actual deal. But there's also, look, I mean, the reference to non-interference, and I mean, they're generally across the region. I think everybody needs to stop funding some of these proxies. And that includes the Emiratis, who do some sketchy stuff in Libya and Yemen and elsewhere. I think these proxy wars are really, which the Iranians are obviously very guilty of, are a major problem and exacerbator of challenges in the region.
We heard before the ceremony when Netanyahu and Trump met in the Oval Office, President Trump made a comment that more countries, he even said 5 or 6, are expected to follow suit. What did you make of that? How quickly and how realistic is that, do you think?
I'm a little skeptical on 5 or 6. That sounds like, I wouldn't be surprised if Oman or Morocco went next. Both because they are, again, not countries that have ever been at war with Israel, because they are more agnostic on these things. For the Omanis, there is also a bit of a intra-GCC, good relations with Israel. The fact that Prime Minister Netanyahu visited there, not only is it partially because the Omanis generally try to have an attitude of engaging with everyone, but also because it buys them points in Washington, which for the Emiratis was a big part of this. So for those reasons, I can see the Omanis going soon. The only challenge they have is they've recently had a succession with the death of Sultan Qaboos, which I don't know if that makes it hard to move on significant foreign policy moves right now.
That's the assessment in Israel. I think that with that change, things need to settle first before things can really progress.
Yeah, I mean, there's always this rumor of Sudan also, but I think that's very much the American administration trying to tie Sudan coming off the terrorism list in exchange for this, which I think the Sudanese really don't want to do, and I don't think is the proper tying together. And then, but the big question is the Saudis.
Of course,
I'm deeply skeptical that they're going to do this anytime soon. At least as long as King Salman is alive, right? Like MBS has, I think, different views on this, but this is a portfolio where when MBS has stepped out too far, his dad has pulled him back, right? And so as long as King Salman is around, I think that Saudi will take a more traditional perspective. And look, one of their big interests, in addition to countering Iran, is this, preserving their status as keepers of, the 2 great mosques. And, engagement with Israel, especially without progress on the Palestinians, leaves them vulnerable to the types of sort of religious attacks and criticism from extremists or from Iran that make them vulnerable on this point. And so I think for them, it's a much more sensitive issue. So, I'm pretty skeptical the Saudis are going anytime soon.
Yeah, I agree. Whilst the king is around, he's probably still committed to his brother's API, and that's still the game in town in Riyadh, at least. one of the other aspects of the deal, obviously, that Netanyahu denied was that the US will now supply the advanced F-35s to the UAE. How significant is that, and how using your expertise in Washington, what sort of response is that going to get in Congress, and the trade-off that Israel may ask for in terms of keeping up the qualitative military edge?
Well, it's very complicated. Usually this, and I worked at the Pentagon for a while in the office that dealt with these issues. And we're sort of doing it backwards, for Trump to cut a political deal first and then to try to go backwards and look at the technical issues. But before you even get to Congress, you really put the defense experts, Israeli and American, together to assess it and figure out what is and is not doable, and what it means for Israel's military edge. And it's hard because the F-35 is the most advanced aircraft we have. So I don't know exactly how you offset that with the Israelis, right? Like, it's much easier to sell F-15s and F-16s into the region, and then you give Israel F-35s, and that's clear offset. And then you get beyond that to Congress, where there's a lot of skepticism about this, both because of Israel's QME, as well as, the Emirati role in Yemen, which I think created a lot of concerns. And so that also is going to raise objections. So I don't see the F-35 deal. This is a long, hard slog. And finally, there's a challenge in that for Israel, in some ways, the UAE having F-35s is not that challenging or not that big of a problem. The UAE is pretty far away. It's still a small country. But it's very hard to see a scenario where the UAE gets F-35s and then the US does not give Saudi F-35s, or does not come under tremendous pressure from Saudi Arabia. It becomes a lot harder to say no to Saudi. And if Saudi were to get F-35s that can be placed in air bases very close to Israel, that really changes the QME situation in the region. So it's partially also a political decision to give something significant to the UAE and then say no to Saudi, that I think will be quite hard. But it seems we'll have to wait and see how this all goes. I think the F-35s deal will play out over a number of years, not weeks.
Very interesting. Thank you for that. You mentioned earlier that kind of how the Gulf states are kind of boxing slightly clever and more sophisticated with keeping up some bipartisan support. There was one story I saw from the Israeli media suggesting that Trump had warned Netanyahu not to reach out to Biden. Do you think that sounds credible?
Trump might have done that or not done that, but I think, Joe Biden, for his part, has been incredibly careful about not really engaging much with foreign leaders through this election cycle. And that is because, if you remember what happened in 2016, when Mike Flynn and the Trump team during the transition, and Jared Kushner too, interfered directly with Obama administration policies by going to foreign governments. And that was really seen as breaking a taboo in American politics regarding and governing, where you have one president at a time. And so traditionally, presidential candidates have met with some foreign leaders during the campaign. It's kind of normal, but I think you take the combination of COVID-19, which has really stopped travel, and this hyper awareness of the bad faith and violations of norms in 2016. And I really think the Biden campaign is not interested in meeting with foreign leaders this time around. So I wouldn't make too big of a deal about Netanyahu not seeing Biden, one way or the other. I don't think it's an American slight of Israel. I don't think it's an Israeli slight of the Democratic Party. I just think that it's generally the situations it on both sides was nah, this is not a good idea to do at this time.
Fair enough. Thank you for that. But more broadly, in terms of what a President Biden, what a presidency would look like in terms of foreign policy and Middle East policy, how do you think? What do you think he would be doing in terms of the Israeli-Palestinian front and this emerging alliance with Israel and the region?
Sure, I don't know exactly. What he has said, and just going by his public statements, I think he would try to reset the U.S.-Palestinian relationship. He's talked about reopening the consulate in Jerusalem. He's not going to move the capital, for from or the embassy, but just to try to make clear that Jerusalem is the final status issue that needs to be negotiated between the parties, which has been the traditional American position. He's talked about resuming assistance and resuming funding for UNRWA, and basically resetting the American role. I think that is going to be a step one. And then I wouldn't expect, this is something I think, Israelis and Palestinians have to start getting used to. Like, we have huge problems here in the United States right now with COVID-19, with China, with our own, internal domestic politics. And the Israeli-Palestinian issue, first of all, the Middle East is becoming less important than it used to be. And then the Israeli-Palestinian issue within the Middle East is becoming less important than it used to be. So I think the days of presidents fixating and spending, and secretaries of state spending a ton of time on this issue, like, I wouldn't expect to see that in the Biden administration. I think it'll be a priority. I think it'll be one amongst a number of priorities. I think there'll be steps taken, but I don't think we'll be rushing back to try and do final status negotiations and high profile meetings. I think there will be an effort to continue to encourage the types of normalization that we have seen between the UAE, Bahrain, and Israel. The vice president welcomed that. But I wouldn't expect some new huge peace push. I wouldn't expect like a George Mitchell type envoy on day 2, or a big effort like the one John Kerry led in 2013 and 14. I think it'll be much more about just trying to reset and put the conflict on a better trajectory and start to build for the long term to create opportunities, eventually, hopefully, to preserve and eventually get back to 2 states.
Very interesting. I think that's one of the assessments shared by Israel and the Gulf, is that there is a general kind of long-term withdrawal or disengagement of the US from the region, and therefore kind of another impetus to rely on local alliances as well instead of the US. Ilan, thank you very much indeed. We've taken up a lot of your time, and that was really very useful. So thank you very much indeed for joining us, and hopefully we can talk again and hear your insights from DC in the future.
Sure, pleasure joining you.